So that is the first approach in which we do the auto wiring, and we have this setter method. So we will put auto wired here. So we create the constructor for the address, and let's put the auto wired here. And
Hello and welcome.
so let's just start by understanding what is auto wiring. It is essentially a powerful feature in the Spring framework which allows us for doing automatic dependency injection. So in simpler terms, it's the Spring way of automatically wiring together the dependencies in your application. How do we make any backend application in Java? The common pattern is that there would be different classes, and each of the classes would need to interact with each other somehow. So how do we compose components of an application? Essentially, your application in Java would consist of different classes, and those classes need to interact with each other. One way is to do it manually, as in you use the new keyword, create the object, and carry on with your business implementation. Other way is to make use of auto wiring with the Spring framework. So with auto wiring, Spring takes care of all the heavy lifting for you. You simply annotate the dependencies, and Spring will automatically detect and inject them whenever it is needed. This is not only going to save you some time, rather it will also keep track of all the beans and objects which are involved in a much more cleaner and maintainable way. So how do we enable auto wiring in Spring? Well, if you were to use an XML configuration method, then in that case you would have to put this particular text inside your XML configuration file, which is context annotation config. However, in the annotation based configuration, all we need to do is create the bean using either of the approaches that we discussed in the earlier videos, and once those beans are available for being used in the application, they are also available for auto wiring. The only prerequisite of enabling auto wiring in Spring is have the beans in the Spring context, and they are available for auto wiring. And what are the different ways in which we can do auto wiring? Well, there are three different ways in which we can do auto wiring. One is like using the auto wiring on properties, then using on setter methods, and finally we can use it on constructors. So we'll do one thing, we will create certain examples and see how exactly do we do auto wiring using all these three approaches. Let's go with the beans package, and we will create something called as address. So since it's supposed to be a bean, let's annotate this with component address. For example, may contain a string, maybe call it as type, maybe a default address. Let's have a constructor and put a message in here, address bean has been created, and probably have a method called as getType. It will just return the type. Then let's create another bean and call it as person. In order to ensure it's bean, let's annotate this with component. The person will have a name, so private string name. We need to have the address here for the given person, so we'll have the address. And to begin with, what we can do is we can create the getters and setters. Now we will try to make use of this in some sort of class. So maybe we will create the person demo class. We are going to create a runner class. So this is your person demo, and let's have a main method. And like always, first we start with creating the context. So context would be annotation config application context. And here is one thing that we should take care of. So essentially we will have to provide the configuration class. So if you remember, what we did is we created this hotel bin. This was created using the component approach, and we had this configuration called as hotel configuration, and it was the configuration for all the packages, all the classes which are there in this particular package. So basically we had the component scan for this particular package. And since we are creating the beans in this package itself, what we will do is we will use the same configuration class. There is no need to create another configuration class. So let's go ahead with the same, and we will have hotel configuration dot class, and from the context we get the bean, the bean is person dot class. Let's assign this to person, and using the person, first of all we will set the name, maybe put my name, and then person dot get name dot print it. So let's print it and see what happens. But before we print, let's go and check that we have all the necessary things which are there in place. So of course we have the name, we have the address, but in order to ensure that the address object is getting created, what we will have to do is we will have to do auto wiring. How do we do auto wiring? We do auto wiring using the auto wired annotation. So the idea is that whenever you do auto wiring, you put an auto wired annotation, and when Spring sees this, what it does is it goes and picks up the bean which is there in the application context, and it makes use of the same, right? So Spring will create this particular object with all the necessary dependencies and everything as required. So now let's go and run this one and see what is the outcome that we are getting. So here is what we have. We are seeing that address bean has been created message from the address constructor is getting printed. And the second thing is, what we did is we first of all set the name here, and then we are going to fetch the name. So that is the first approach in which we do the auto wiring using the auto wired annotation over the particular field itself. So the other approach is using it on the top of setter. So let's remove it, and we have this setter method. So we will put auto wired here, and what essentially it should do is we created the object here for address using the auto wiring. Similarly, it should do the same. So let's run the person demo and see if it's working as expected. Clear it out. So yeah, it's working as expected. You see the same message that address has been created, and then the name which was set, that is being printed as well. The final approach is making use of this on the constructor. So let's create the constructor first. So we create the constructor for the address, and let's put the auto wired here, and let's run the demo class, and we see the output is same, which means that it is working as expected. Now with respect to constructor based auto wiring, there are a few things that we may wish to focus on. First is, whenever we are doing a constructor based auto wiring, it is way of enforcing that these dependencies are kind of non-optional, as in they are mandatory. So even if you don't put this auto wired annotation on top of it, it will work as expected. So let's run it and see what is happening. Well, it's working. So the way it happens is that you're going to call the constructor and then set this. So Spring does understand it implicitly that when you are providing a bean dependency and you are setting it up in the constructor, then you wish to do an auto wiring, probably constructor auto wiring. But it's a good idea to have this auto wired placed on top of it. It surely improves your readability. So it's a good practice to have. Out of all the three options that we have, I think the setter based injection is the least preferred one, because it's not very intuitive or readable. So although it is there, it is very rarely used. And then we have the field based injection and then the constructor based injection. So you can use field based injection whenever particular dependency is kind of an optional dependency, and whenever you have to enforce a very mandatory kind of dependency, it's good to have that in the constructor based injection. Please note that it's not that you cannot have a non-mandatory dependency when you do constructor injection, and it's not that you cannot have a sort of very mandatory dependency if you do a field based injection. You can surely do it as you please. Now let's have a look around the optional dependencies. So in the same example, let's go ahead and maybe delete, or rather comment the component, execute the person demo and see what happens. Well, we get an error exception, and it says no such bean definition exception. And why so? It says that no qualifying bean of type address is available, and it expected at least one bean which qualifies as an auto-wire candidate. So basically what happened is it was expecting a bean of this particular type rather, and then it could not find it because we removed the component annotation here, the Spring could not create this bean, and thus we ran into this particular error. So what does it signify? It signifies that whenever you're trying to dependency, there are two ways. One is where you surely need a dependency, so of course this is the way to implement it, that you provide that auto wiring construct, right? Other thing is, let's say in certain cases you may not need that dependency. That dependency could come or may not come. So in that case, somehow you need to hint that alright, this is an optional dependency. So how do you go about it? Well, to have that optional dependency, what we do is, while we are doing an auto wiring, we have another property called as required, and we can mark that as false. So when we do it as false, it should help us with marking this as a non-mandatory dependency or an optional dependency. So let's see what happens. I think we are again getting the error. This is not working, of course. So how do we correct this? So as it happens that in case of the constructor based injection, what we need to do is, instead of having it here on the top of the constructor method, we should have it inside the parameter itself. So basically we mark auto wired required false for this particular parameter. So whenever injection is being done for this dependency, Spring will take care of the use cases, and it will understand that this thing could be optional. So in the cases where it's not getting the bean for this particular address, it will not create any issue by throwing an exception. Rather, it will continue with its own execution. So let's delete it and see what's happening. So yeah, so basically it did not complain, it did not throw an exception. Rather, it could not get created, so we did not see this message. All we saw was creation of this name and then getting of this particular name itself. So that's how it's in the case of constructor based injection. So let's say if we remove this and then we come to the part where we have this auto wired, and then probably if you do required as false, it will work as expected. So in the case of property based injection, the field based injection, all we need to do is, other than auto wired, have this required as false, and it should work as expected. So yeah, it's working as expected. Now let's revert this to the component. So basically we have this bean available for us. This should conclude the discussion around the optional dependencies. So what we saw just now is an optional dependency. You hint an optional dependency by having this property required as false. Next, we will move to the part where we discuss a bit about auto wiring disambiguation and what are the different ways in which we could handle it. So let's start with an example to understand auto wiring disambiguation concept. So in the beans, we will create an interface, maybe call it as authentication service, and it will have one method, call it as auth, and then we will create a few implementations for this particular interface. First one, let's call it as vanilla authentication, and of course mark it as component. Now let's have a constructor and let it return a message, something like calling vanilla auth service, and here we can again print authenticated using vanilla authentication. Similarly, let's go back and create another implementation of this interface, maybe call it as OAuth authentication. Let's implement this method, and of course let's mark it as a component. Next thing to do would be create a constructor. Let's print a message similar to what we did for the other class, calling OAuth authentication service, and in this case again print something like authenticated using OAuth. Now let's create another service, maybe call it as login service, have it as a component. So inside the login service, we will be needing the dependency for the authentication service. So we have authentication service, and let's print a message, maybe call as authentication service.auth. What are the different ways of auto wiring this dependency? So of course we can start by putting an auto wire on this particular field, and let's see what happens. So in order to run this demo, let's create another class, maybe call it as login demo. We start by writing the main method. First we will create the context, so new annotation config application context. As we discussed earlier, let's have hotel configuration as the configuration class, and from the context get the bean. The bean name is going to be login service dot class. So we have login service, and let's print the login service dot message. So let's run it and see what is the outcome. All right, we have an error. What does the error say? It says no unique bean definition exception. And what is the message? So no qualifying bean of type authentication service. It expected single matching bean, but it found two. So it was expecting one bean, but it found one for OAuth authentication, other for vanilla authentication. So this is the ambiguity that we were talking about earlier. Of this particular type, there are two beans in the bean context, but Spring does not know which one to use, and that is where it has started to throw this exception. So how can we resolve this? So one easy approach to resolve this is by putting another annotation, which is called as qualifier. So in the qualifier, we will put the bean name which we want to be put in the dependency. So for this we have vanilla authentication. Please note that in the vanilla authentication class, this component, when it's created, when this is registered as a bean, inside the Spring context it will registered by the same name. It's just that the first character will be made to a lowercase. So we are using the same. So essentially in the qualifier we are putting the same name, except we made it to a lowercase. Now the Spring will go and it will auto wire this particular bean type out of the two available options. So there is no ambiguity now, and we have kind of resolved the ambiguity. Let's run it and see what is the outcome. So it says calling vanilla auth service, and then calling OAuth authentication service, and then authenticated using the vanilla authentication. So reason it's also calling the OAuth authentication services, because while we are starting the application, of course this bean will also be registered, and during the registry process this particular constructor will be called, and this message will be called, this message will be printed rather. So that is the reason it's getting printed. But other than that, main point of focus here is that we are calling the vanilla authentication service. So essentially what we have done is we have resolved two available options as one, like we had the option of OAuth authentication and vanilla authentication, but we chose to go with this one, and this is how we resolved the ambiguity. So this is in the case of when we do a field based injection. What happens when we try to have a constructor based injection? Let's have a quick look on that as well. So we do auto wired, and now let's try to put qualifier and the vanilla authentication. Seems like compiler is complaining somehow. What might be the reason? Well, when we focus here, it says qualifier not applicable to constructor. So does it mean that we cannot resolve this ambiguity in case of constructor injection? No, this is not the case. Just remember what we saw earlier in the case of optional dependency. In the case of constructor based injection, we were placing the annotation here in the method, not on the top of the method itself. So essentially this qualifier annotation will go on the parameter level. So basically we put this particular qualifier annotation here in the parameter, and now it should work as expected. Let's clean it out and see what's coming up. All right, So basically we can see that it's coming up as expected. We can do one more thing, as in whenever we are creating the component, we can provide a name for it, right? So let's say we come to this particular bean, and other than component, I also provide a name. Maybe call it as better auth, and then probably let's make use of this name inside the login service. So instead of vanilla authentication, I said better auth, and let's run it and see what happens, right? So essentially it switched to OAuth authentication, wherein it's calling the OAuth authentication service and authenticated using OAuth. So this is another way in which we can explicitly call out and place a name, rather give a name to the component or the bean that we are creating, and the same name could be used for the qualifier annotation as well. So this should conclude the part where we were trying to learn about the auto wiring disambiguation. So we did it in two ways. First is using the qualifier, other is where we provided an explicit name to the bean and used that while auto wiring. Let's also have a quick look around what is the default auto wiring. So the default auto wiring in Spring is by type. What does it mean? So essentially, whenever you are doing an auto wiring, then Spring will try to find out the bean of this particular type. So let's say if you placed auto wired on this particular field, it will go and find out what is the type for this particular bean, what is the type of this bean, and how many beans are available. If there is only one bean, it will go and auto wire the same. If there is more than one, then in that case it will go and auto wire the one which you provide, that is the qualifier. So finally, let's have a look around what are the advantages of auto wiring. So of course it has like couple of advantages. Promotes loose coupling between components. It does improve code reliability quite a bit, and then it will also enhance the testability of mocking the dependencies during testing. In coming up videos, we will have a completely dedicated playlist around how we do testing in the case of a Spring framework. So we will cover these things in much more details over there. Now just to conclude and sum up the things that we have done till now. So this was just an example. There is no business logic as such which has been implemented. But the idea is that whenever you are creating a real world application, you will have certain components, and then you will need to provide some sort of wiring so that they could interact with each other. One way to do is like you can use the new keyword. So for example, I could have created this object using the new keyword, wherein I could have used new of auth authentication or something similar, but that would not lead to a clean code first. Second, Spring will not know that what are the beans that has been created when you use the new keyword, and essentially you lose all the benefits of creating a bean and placing it in the Spring context. And the other way is where you have this auto wiring concept. So you first create the beans, and once you have created the beans, all you need to do is just make use of it in whatever place you may wish to have. So for example, here we are using inside a component. Tomorrow you may use it in some sort of controller class as well. So essentially the idea is it can be used anywhere as long as it's available in the bean context, or you could auto wire as needed. So that shall be it for this video. Thanks for watching. This video is part of a playlist on the Spring framework. Playlist is designed to progressively teach Spring concepts step by step. I have made sure the quality is super good. I do request you to visit the playlist. Link is in the description. Thanks for sticking with me till last. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to my channel. I hope this video added some value. If so, please hit that like button and share with your friends. Your honest feedback in the comments is valuable to me. I regularly post informative videos on software engineering and computer science. Don't forget to hit the bell for instant updates. Take care and stay awesome.